Hello, and thank you for joining this webcast. My name is Caroline Dewing. I'm the co-founder of Future Agenda, and next to me is MCKENNA, the Managing Director of Accenture Health in the UK. Together, and then with a wider panel in Oslo and Barcelona, we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so exploring some of the themes that were raised during the recent joint study on the future of patient data. And then we're going to discuss how we could better manage health data going ahead. So some logistics before we begin. As an audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar. So please do ask, because we're here to answer your questions, and we will do our best to respond as quickly as we can. Now, I'd like to ask Neve, why? Why did we do some work on patient data? Could you give us a little bit of context and put the whole report into the wider scheme of health?
Sure. So thank you so much, Caroline. First and foremost, we've been really excited and very pleased to be involved in this research. It's so important. Data is at the heart of everything we do in healthcare. And so really understanding some of the challenges and opportunities that sit alongside that whole patient data agenda, so important. And we've seen some of those challenges emerge and the need to get that balance between, making a lot of data available for research, for insight, whilst balancing, issues around ownership. So it's been a great experience for us, and the report itself has got some really interesting conclusions.
Great, thank you. Just to give you a little bit of understanding of what we actually did, the whole report was based on a series of workshops which we held around the world, 11 countries, 12 different workshops. And we started with an initial point of view, which we shared at each workshop, and we built the opinions and the understanding as we went around the world. And we had London, Sydney, Singapore, Norway, South Africa, you name it, we went there. And we encouraged experts from a broad church within the health sector to come and join us. It was under Chatham House rules, so that everybody felt free to express their true opinions and challenge the assumptions that each workshop progressed. And as a result, we were able to come out with what we hope is an interesting and forthright report. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the broader panel. Could I go to Oslo?
Hello, from Oslo. This is ANDREAS. I'm the medical director in Norway. My background is from medicine. I'm a medical doctor by trade, and I spent a couple of years doing physician work with patients on different levels in the healthcare system before I did research in cardiology and cardiac surgery. And then I got very motivated to work on data in all levels of the healthcare system, because the value is so fantastically great for medicine and for patients and for society. So that's my motivation for joining, and it's very exciting to be in this position and be able to talk about these issues that we're going to discuss today, and the Future Agenda partnership that we had, and the workshopping which we did in Norway, in Oslo last year, was really exciting, because there are some big issues to discuss when trying to figure out how to go forward in managing these research data for the benefit of all of us. So, and my partner here is Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne THORSENG. I also work here at the Norway office of Accenture. I hold a PhD in health informatics, where I've done research on how we can better build good digital services for patients. And in Accenture, I also work on different public sector projects of creating good digital services for patients and citizens. And I think what I find most interesting about this field is how you have new models of care and the technology that supports that, and how that sort of what happens when that clashes and meets with how the existing health services is organized. And I was also very lucky, together with Andreas, to organize the Norwegian chapter of the Future Agenda workshop here in Oslo. That was a true joy. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And what about going to Barcelona now?
Hi everyone, I'm Gaston BESANSON. I'm a data scientist, one of the architects for the Health Analytics Innovation Center for Europe, based in Barcelona. I've been training many verticals over the past years. I've been moving into health, and I'm excited to see what our knowledge, both functional and technical, can bring insights to patient data and health-related issues.
Thank you, Gaston. And I hope you agree we have an informed and an enthusiastic panel. So I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation today. So we ought to start with the report. What were the findings? Well, we identified effectively 4 challenges, 4 opportunities, and some emerging issues. And we're going to do our best to talk through them all just now. Starting with the main challenges, across the board there were essentially 4 common challenges: integration, ownership versus access, trust, and privacy and security. And these were important really for every single market, sometimes in different ways, but every single market is trying to wrestle with these challenges as they plan for the future. Let's start first with integration. Can't even say the word. Integration. In Frankfurt and in Singapore, in Oslo and in London, Johannesburg, San Francisco and Boston, they all considered this a high priority issue. There's general agreement that although some organizations are kind of wary of sharing data, actually for the common good, we need to work out how to do it effectively. And perhaps this is through a regulatory process, by establishing standards that we can all work to. Andreas, what do you think of that as a suggestion?
Well, that's a very important question to ask, because when it comes to integration, you need some standards to discuss. You need some common grounds and some common definitions before you can start analyzing and looking at the data that comes in. And to put it very simply, this webcast would be useless and make no sense if we didn't have a common integration in language, which is a standard of English. When it comes to health data, I think for the healthcare system as a whole, we need to confine the discussion a little bit down to, let's talk about, for example, the personal level and the societal level and the medical level of the need for standards. So the ambition going forward, I think, in many ways is for the social determinants of health data, maybe the wearables for the personal data collections to be integrated with the professional healthcare system in ways that can give new diagnostic tools, and maybe efficacy can be increased. And in my opinion, we're quite far from establishing a set of standards on, let's say, consumer wearables and measuring devices that can be integrated with the traditional healthcare system data. And that poses a challenge for the clinical world and the world of medicine, because we have these tools and these data that already do a quite good job. So when the first thing is to establish standards so that let's say, data from other sources than the non-traditional ones from the personal level can be integrated. They need to prove themselves against these established let's say, data types and data analysis that are being conducted today. So we need a set of standards for all sets of modern measuring devices, which are lined up for the next coming years. On a societal level, you can think of the necessity for standards when you try to compare the efficacy and treatment effects across regions and across borders. And you can't really compare apples and pears. we need to across the borders establish these standards so we can like make comparisons in a better way, and we also need to talk about the same things. And these are nuances. You know, the medical community are quite strict on how to interpret data. So you know, for the medical community, you have already the HL7 standards for medical equipment. You have the FHIR standard, the SNOMED CT, and the Open EHR. And these are big organizations trying and have been tried for several years and even decades to establish a common set of standards. But it's extremely hard, but it's very important. And unfortunately, the medical community also evolves. So you get some new definitions and new diseases and new types of treatment that needs to be incorporated in a way that that everyone can agree. So it's a big challenge. It's not impossible, but yeah, I think you get my point. So
yes, I get your point. Thank you.
And
I get your point. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I think that we're on the border now trying to use fantastic technologies, AI, machine learning, natural language processing. But we need to handle the issues of standards, for example, and integration before we start unleashing these technologies, because it will, in a way, backfire. I think if these common grounds are not in place, then the analytic power of AI will not make sense, because it's like the garbage in, garbage out principle will also, in a way, be valid for the integration and standard discussion, in addition to the data quality. So,
yes, that's a very good point,
yeah.
And it's tricky, isn't it? And that's without even talking about legacy systems and so on and so forth. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, you know, certainly in the UK, I know that interoperability is a big discussion point, yeah. and how to harness this data. And if you think about, you know, the National Health Service, obviously, there's no competition between hospitals, but they still can't quite crack that nut of being able to share that data freely. I totally agree with Andreas. We absolutely have to get that data right if we're going to make the AI and make the most of those kinds of technologies. I think the other dimension I would just add onto that is we've got to have those standards, but the other thing is we shouldn't let ourselves get too wrapped up in long standard setting cycles. And perhaps sometimes we could just create smaller integration data sets, use that for a set of purposes, and then try and build from there. I think sometimes there's a risk of paralysis almost, where we sort of try and solve everything. And as Andreas correctly pointed out, medical technology is moving on, diagnosis is moving on, so we won't necessarily get it all right up front, as long as we can create a platform for which we can add.
Yeah, it's a case of sensitive regulation, really, isn't it? And trying to make regulation as flexible as possible, given the challenges of understanding how technology will develop in the next 5, 10, 15 years. One of the issues that also was raised in multiple markets was the issues around access and ownership. If access to patient data is to have impact, it needs to be aggregated and shared. But who owns that process and how it is rolled out is a challenge. And a lot of the conversations we were involved in talked about patients having increasing control of their data. But the issue about a patient having control of their data is, one, they have to care about it. So when you're fit and healthy, maybe you don't care so much about your personal health records, but as you become increasingly unwell, it becomes more of a priority to you. But when you're unwell, you might not have the faculty to deal with your whole decision-making process as who has access to your data and who and whether or not you're giving permission for it to be owned. So how are we going to manage the access and ownership in the future? How do you think that's going to work out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I see a lot of startups in this space trying to solve that problem. There are quite a number which have a blockchain-style technology where you, as a patient, you own that. You can then grant access on a temporary basis, for example, to a physician or so on. I think some of the balance around that, particularly as you just mentioned, is perhaps the sort of frail or vulnerable people. You know, have they got the capacity to own that data? Then if they share it, do they know who they're sharing it with? Then we're going to get onto security later and the value of a medical record on the black market. And so I think we're going to have to try and be quite sensitive to how we empower the patient, which is essentially, you know, what GDPR is trying to do, say you own that data, whilst making sure that we provide people with the digital tools necessary to do that. And I'm sure Anna has some thoughts around that digital tools, because that's so important. I think technology itself is helping us. People are much more au fait with smartphones and so on. So some of those technologies become a bit easier then.
Yes, that's true. Gaston, what do you think about...
Sorry,
and I'll come to you in a second. Gaston, I just wonder, what do you think about the whole access and ownership piece? Are you feeling confident that patients will be able to retain ownership of their own data in the future?
I agree with what was commented before. I think access and ownership, even though they go together, access has kind of a view of some degree of centrality, right? Even like allowing a platform, you know, where you can come in and see all the data that you need, right? Providing all these scales, economies of scale or scopes that can allow you to wrangle data and produce insights. But on the other side, as was mentioned, you see distributed ledger technologies as blockchain coming in and providing you the possibility to turn on, turn off, you know, the access to your personal data. I think these two things need to coexist, because you need centrality, you need some degree of trust over someone that gives you access to data, anonymized, encrypted, but also you want, given the fact that you start to see the value of your own data, from an economic point of view or a privacy one, you want to remain some traceability or control of who has access to. So I think this debate between centrality and decentralization is going to come heavily in the health sector. And as was mentioned, startups are being really aggressive on the solutioning side, but I still think that you need to, you know, solutioning is a second step. First, design. Let's design what will be our system, how much we consent as a patient, our physicians or companies to bring insights, but on the other side, how these companies are accountable for the information or provide feedbacks to these patients in a decentralized way, either, of course, by IoT devices or, again, decentralized ledger technologies for access control. So mainly, I think I see a fight here.
Yeah, I agree. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that giving access to patient data for patients also needs to be seen in a context where health personnel is doing their job, and that sharing, that you would have certain, it needs to be done in close cooperation also with the medical communities, because you would have certain areas where there would be a reason not to share data at a certain point for certain psychiatry diagnosis maybe. You have, in my research, I've been listening to health personnel who's argued, for example, working with children where parents normally would have access to their child's medical record, but in a case of, for example, child abuse, that would hinder the doctor to write something about the child, for example. So it's not a straightforward just opening up everything if it is to work in a everyday clinical practice.
Yes, I think the whole problem is sometimes we take a large paintbrush to paint a small space, and when we're considering issues such as child protection or vulnerable adults, you're right. We really do have to spend some time thinking about what is possible and what is realistic within the patient care environment. Yes, thank you for that. Which actually brings me on to quite it's a neat segue into the next challenge, which is all about trust. It's a priority. We all have to trust our doctors to treat us well, to find a solution to whatever particular illness we are suffering from. But doctors also have to trust the drug providers, they have to trust government for the funding and so on and so forth. And now there are new companies coming on board, and the issue of trust is becoming quite complex as big tech makes its mark on the patient data space. So Anna, you've spent a long time thinking about this sort of thing. Do you want to expand a little bit on your findings?
Yeah, well, I think that trust is absolutely vital in this space. You need to be able to trust just being in the doctor's office. I need to trust that the doctor that I'm seeing wants to do what's in my best interest for me to share, and also to be able to take part in clinical trials, for example. But it's also important on an institutional level that I trust the hospital as a whole, or the authorities as a whole, to be able to use the health services. But we've seen that this balance of trust is shifting. It's shifted from a place where health personnel knew it all, and you came in as more of a passive recipient of care. And now I think that more and more of us are coming in more knowledgeable. We know more, and maybe we're also a little bit more skeptical. We sort of, you need to prove a little bit more as health personnel. Maybe you could elaborate on that later. But I think that important to maintaining trust is probably transparency, that you're able to see what different health providers, governments, or now new big tech has registered about you, as we see with the GDPR legislation, who has what registered about me. And also that once you actually are able to see the data that someone has registered, we also see that data quality improves drastically. We've seen that in several projects here in Norway, at least. Once they open up registries, even though it's just where your house is and who your spouse is and who your parents are, once people have access to that, they discover faults. And the same, I think, goes with medical data. It also improves the data quality. Yes, and the last point on this is now that we see, just one last point, when we see increasingly intelligent algorithms, AI, and so, it's how do you ensure, I don't have the answer, but how do you ensure trust, both from the health personnel side and also from the patient side, that how is this decision made? Why do they recommend drug A instead of drug B?
I know, Neve, you've been doing some work on AI. Thank you, Anna. I know, Neve, you've been doing some work on AI. Do you have any views?
I mean, I think absolutely. It's clear that AI, artificial intelligence, at some level, is going to be very impactful in the health arena. And so I think it's very critical that AI is explainable, and that you can see the decision-making process, you can see that how it has arrived at the conclusions that it's arrived at. I mean, I think I don't personally envisage, in the near future, anything like AI just going off and unilaterally creating a conclusion, saying, right, here's your diagnosis, here's your prescription, off you go. It's more, I think, about helping the doctors synthesize huge volumes of data in order to assist them in their relationship with the patient. So actually, it's less about the AI, having artificial intelligence explain itself to the patient, but it's explaining its information to the doctor, and then the doctor's taking all of these things together and then presenting that to the patient in terms of a diagnosis or relationship. So I think ideally it will really be something that's an and model. It's not an or model. It's very much going to be just another toolkit that the doctor has. They have lots of machines and technology available today, and AI will be one of those other tools that they have.
Yeah. That's very interesting, actually, because we, in one of the workshops in Singapore, we were talking about how AI is helping pregnant women, in fact, conservative pregnant women, deal with some issues that they have that they don't want to engage with their male doctor. and AI was playing quite a strong role in that environment, enabling people to talk candidly about personal issues without feeling the embarrassment of having to undress in front of a man or tell embarrassing physical sort of experiences. So I agree with you. I think AI has a role to play, and funnily enough, in some instances, individuals may trust the machine more than the individual, a real doctor. Andreas, what do you think? You are a real doctor.
I am a real doctor.
And skeptical now.
So what I think it's very important to remember that, as Neves mentioned, that AI is for sure going to help us, and but we need to remember that the tradition in medicine is quite hard on the demand for evidence and comparison over time, and that slow progress is actually a good thing, because then we know that for sure this treatment A is better than treatment B, and we expand these findings to other groups, and the world of medical progress it's quite slow, but it has its good traditions, and just last week I noticed a new study a new publication in Nature that showed that AI algorithms had been used for assessing the retina, and this is a source which is not commonly used for assessing assessing a risk score for cardiovascular events. But they managed to show through a peer-reviewed publication in Nature, that they were able to use AI to compete with established risk factors or risk algorithms for cardiovascular risk. And to me, that's a good example of how AI should be, at least for many fields in medicine. You need to go that road through the peer review processes, and in small projects target some specific problem, because medicine it's extremely wide. It's not only we're talking about efficacy, and for people like in this call, we are resourceful and above average healthy, I presume, for all of us, and we have but there are many people that needs AI in another way, because they for their disease and their specific small, or at least subgroups of challenges, AI can be applied. So there are extremely a wide variety of fields to apply it, but it needs to be speak the language of this existing medical community, just to speak, I think.
Thank you.
Caroline, can I jump in?
You absolutely can. Please do.
So I agree completely on the point of machine learning as a recommendation for physicians, for any operator of decision making. There's a big effort on white boxing, what we call the black box of machine learning, so everyone can know a little bit how these algorithms are behaving and how they are accountable of their predictions. But over the past month, working with physicians on creating variables for these algorithms, you see the true value of preparing that input, which is the true value for the result, in variables, in features that make sense for later being used in AI, right? And the most advanced AI that everyone's talk about, you see this called reinforcement learning, is actually a translation for trial and error. So you need to be on top of your AI. And me coming from before, when I was younger, from economics, the models were the benchmark. You always were the person taking the final decision. So here is the same. AI are the benchmarks where decision makers use them to take the final decision. Follow a recommendation, or on top of that recommendation, make a more powerful decision. So that was just a summary of what we talked. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very useful. Thank you. I'm charging through the results of the report, so I know we can talk a lot about each of the areas we're discussing, but just to move on to the final challenge, which was security and privacy. Can you have security and privacy? I suppose, in a nutshell, that's the question. If you have security, you have to have surveillance, and if you want privacy, then you can't share information. How does that materialize in a health environment? And how I'm going back to Andreas now as our resident doctor. How do you think we should manage this issue? And particularly thinking about that from a research point of view. And Anna, you might well want to interject at this.
Well, I'm thinking about two things that I hope will come for the future, because as we talked about earlier, the patient becomes more empowered, knowing more about themselves and their data. And I think we need to also not paint with a big brush on this topic, because there are subsets of information when you in your health record. So you might be comfortable sharing your broken leg information in the car accident, but diseases can be affiliated with stigmas, psychiatric disease, for example. And I think if technology and the involvement of technology can make it possible for patients to decide which subset of data they can share, and choose to not share other types of data, that would be maybe the ideal situation in the era of personalized medicine and patient-centered medicine. That's one big point. Then, yeah.
Maybe also I think that was one of the interesting findings from at least the Oslo workshop of Future Agenda, was how someone mentioned that the willingness to share data for patients are sometimes bigger than we think. We always think of patient data as something very, very private, but given the opportunity that if you share your data, it will help you or someone else with a similar disease, I think a lot of us will be willing to share those data. And yeah.
Right. Neve, I know we're sharp on time, but just a quick word about security. You have
I mean, I think the challenge with security is particularly if we're looking at centralization, interoperability, creating rich databases that we can mine, for AI, as we've talked about. The challenge there will be around being able to secure that data in a good way. And I think that balance of regional, national and local becomes quite important. The advantage of a more centralized system is you can obviously then ship in more experts. You can, if you store things on a centralized cloud, you can benefit from the security that an AWS or Azure bring to you. But then you also then create a large database that's vulnerable to cyber attack and is almost a magnet. So you've got to balance that within the local, whereas can you really secure things at local? And certainly we've seen with some of the attacks that we saw last year in the health environment, where we saw perhaps some of the challenges at a local environment where you're trying to either recruit the right level of professionals or make very meaningful decisions about investment around, do I buy an MRI machine or do I invest in some more security infrastructure? So I think these are some of the challenges you have, and personally I think it's easier to lean slightly towards a regional at least security level, because I think it is a challenge that's too big for very local providers to take.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, we in one of the discussions we had in South Africa, actually, they were talking about security from a national level, and that particularly picking on DNA, they are very unwilling to share South African DNA with the US, which is where it could be analysed, because they consider it an issue of national security. And the same thing could be said in Singapore. So just understanding what we mean by security and how data can become a sort of an area of health data can become an area of national security. We saw it as a growing challenge around the world.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah. There are opportunities as well. Do you know what? We're going to have to scoot on. I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay.
There are opportunities around as well. Personalization, data marketplaces, the impact of AI, we've talked about that a little bit, and new business models. So, and personalization, more individualized healthcare, it's accelerating. Tell me, do you think that's a good thing, and how can we make the most of it? And you've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay.
Yes,
being short, I think it's obviously it will benefit lots of people to have personalized and more targeted healthcare. It requires things as structured EMRs. You need to be able to get that health data to do that analysis on how to give a more targeted treatment. I think it's something it's nothing new. You probably do it every time a patient comes to you. You try to personalize your treatment, right? But technology makes it easier to do it even more sophisticated. But I think what's most interesting about this whole personalized medicine thing is how it, again, clashes with how we do things and how medicine works today. So we need to look at how we do our existing research protocols. Now suddenly you're going to recommend one drug, for example, to one person, not to a large cohort of people. That's interesting. How do you do that? How do you organize reimbursements from the state, for example, giving one treatment which isn't sort of approved by a governmental level that will reimburse money? And you would have to go into discussions on how to prioritize increasingly expensive drugs. And we saw that the Minister of Health here in Norway, he went out to the board that prioritizes expensive treatments and said that you need to prepare for this era of personalized medicine because it's going to be a game changer and you need to figure out how to do that. I think
totally. We had a discussion
around this.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. We had a discussion actually in Frankfurt around with a bunch of. Can you have a bunch of pharmaceuticals with a number of pharmaceutical organisations, and their view very clearly was that the era of blockbuster drugs is now over, and they have to kind of reconsider their business model. Going on to new models, given the rise of big tech and the whole issue of personalization, new business models coming out of of data. Can you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see. The startup market in health is so vibrant. I think I must get invited to a sort of startup event every other week at the moment. It feels like. So it's definitely an area that people are looking to find opportunities where you see an awful lot of players trying to find ways to disrupt the market. I think there's a lot of discussion around the Amazon coming in. Are they going to, what would Amazon do? I think that may happen in the US, less so I can see in Europe, perhaps, where we have more national based systems. Where I think the real disruption is going to happen is actually from the patient empowerment angle. When you see, and I think Andreas touched on it earlier, people who are have a quite a rare disease or condition, who are trying to solve problems and connecting with people around the world in a way that has never been possible before, and what that might do in terms of disruption, because what it'll do is help them solve problems in perhaps a completely different way and be running to their physicians and saying, actually, this has happened over in Japan, and this is working, and I think we need to look at this. So it pulls in some of the themes Anna was talking about, as well as we're getting more involved in our healthcare. So I think we might see disruption coming in from a more grassroots level.
Oh, that's interesting, because another area we've discussed was data marketplaces, and maybe that would facilitate exactly what you're discussing here. Gaston, do you have 2 minutes to talk about data marketplaces?
I can do it in a minute. No, I think that the markets are kind of the output of many things that we talked today. being able to have interoperability, being able to have one ontology or small ontologies, right? Being able to aggregate, being able to either encrypt or anonymize, right? So if we are able to do this, then the next step is being able to consume this with algorithms, right? And also coming back to again, it's a buzzword, but you know, on data market, you have this of aggregation and being able to put an algorithm on top, you know, fuel for the algorithm and produce insight. But now with distributed ledgers as blockchain, you are able to, you know, this idea of tokenization of your data, being able to pay these patients for the use of that data. So from a solutioning perspective, data market would be kind of the end output of all the things that we have talked, and will allow better insights, but also have traceability and some payback for your data being used. So I think it's a big opportunity, has its own challenges, as we talked before.
Thank you. Finally, the last opportunity that we outlined was AI. I mean, it's on the tip of everybody's tongue, and part of me, and I think maybe part of you would sort of suggest that our expectation might be greater than the potential just at the moment. Is that fair, or do you...
I think, yes. I mean, and there's been a lot in the press recently as well about that. I think that there's been a number of articles criticising some AI in the US and in its true ability in cancer diagnosis, etc. I think there are some good headlines around, you know, robots and doctors being, you know, robots, and I don't need to, you know, go and see a person anymore. The reality is, of course, very different. I think it has tremendous potential, of which I think everybody is pretty much agreed. I think the real and practical applications are still quite emerging, and I think those use cases are still proving themselves out. That's what I see around the patch. I haven't seen, you know, generalized widespread applications. I've seen some really good examples in certain places, but I think it's about taking those really great examples. In fact, they've got some really good ones in Spain, and then applying them a bit more widely to get that scale, which is back to what Andreas was saying at the beginning, that evidence. You know, doctors need to see the evidence before they'll trust it.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. There are many other issues that we addressed in the report, and I would encourage you to look at the Accenture website and download the report and have a browse. Digital inequality is a big one for me, as is data sovereignty, but I think the moment has come where we have to leave you to make your own decisions, and I really hope that you found today interesting. Anna, Andreas, Gaston and Niamh here in the studio, and from me, thank you very much for your time, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.